I am incredibly proud of this entire team, Rachel Miller said, raising her paper cup of burnt breakroom coffee like it was vintage crystal champagne. She meant every word of it, too. It was unheard of across the entire regional industry. Donald Briggs, our shy but razor-sharp lead accountant, offered a quiet half-smile as he adjusted his glasses. Still think we should have sprung for real bakery cake instead of these powdered donuts. We will get real bakery cake, the exact second corporate wires the quarterly bonus pool, replied Rachel from procurement, tapping her inbox on her phone as if she were trying to physically summon a genie. $50,000 allocated to our unit, which comes out to exactly $1,000 each right after federal withholding tax. Supposed to be, I muttered, taking a slow sip of coffee. I did not say it out loud, but I had not told my 10-year-old son about the planned trip to Disney World yet. And 22 years in corporate governance had taught me never to celebrate until the money cleared the automated clearinghouse. The files were archived in cold storage, and the audit logs triple confirmed the transfer. Still, deep down in my chest, I allowed myself a rare moment of actual optimism. We had hit every operational metric set by the board. When the all-hands calendar invite landed in our inboxes at 9 o'clock that morning with the subject line Quarterly Performance Celebration plus CEO Town Hall, nobody on our floor blinked. Chad Montgomery, the newly appointed chief executive officer, had been parachuted in from the parent conglomerate 3 weeks earlier, after our former executive took a sudden early retirement following a shareholder dispute. Chad was an odd corporate specimen, looking and acting like someone had taught a hyperactive golden retriever how to navigate LinkedIn. He bounced into conference rooms like he was constantly rehearsing for a tech conference presentation that nobody had asked for, ending nearly every sentence with an awkward wink or an unprompted high five. Still, I had seen far worse executives in my career. At least Chad had not touched our core compliance protocols yet. But on the afternoon of the town hall, something felt fundamentally wrong the moment we stepped off the elevators. The break room snacks were suspiciously dyed bright pink. "Hell yeah, team," Chad yelled into his wireless headset microphone, his voice muffled behind the tight red and black fabric mask. Fourth quarter. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the room. Someone near the back coughed awkwardly. Chad yanked off the fabric mask, his slick-back hair standing up like he had just touched a high-voltage wire. "Look, I know you were all expecting a cash bonus announcement today. We are investing in community, in human connection, in true corporate family." He reached into a velvet bag sitting on the podium and pulled out a thick stack of glossy cards, handing them out to the front row like a street performer handing out flyers. "So instead of a monetary payout, you are all officially invited to my son Timmy's 8th birthday party this coming Saturday." Nobody moved. Nobody made a sound. "Oh, it is as real as it gets," Chad beamed, clapping his hands together. "There will be artisanal pizza, a triple-tier bounce house, custom character cupcakes, and at 2 o'clock, I am personally leading a youth leadership workshop titled, 'What Would Thor Do?' You are going to love it." Donald stared down at the glossy invitation handed to him as if it were contaminated with radioactive waste. I felt a cold, heavy stillness settle deep in my stomach. I glanced over at Human Resources. Chloe, the newly hired HR manager, was standing near the door with a plastic smile so tight her cheekbones twitched. So, I spoke up, keeping my voice impeccably calm across the quiet room. "The approved team bonus pool is canceled?" "Not canceled, Valerie," Chad chirped, pointing a finger gun at me. "Reimagined. Cake pops." Donald opened his mouth to speak, closed it without making a sound, then quietly stood up from his chair and walked straight out of the auditorium. Nobody clapped. I did not hear another word he said. I was too busy mentally reviewing the formal authorization memo signed by the chief financial officer 6 weeks prior, which had explicitly confirmed the $500,000 bonus pool as budgeted, approved, and legally allocated under our operational guidelines. Not with a dramatic explosion, but with the cold, definitive click of a padlock snapping shut. The day following Chad's superhero performance, the office felt like an uncomfortable funeral for common sense. The carpeted hallways were quiet in that high-pressure way, where everyone pretends to review spreadsheets while privately contemplating their life choices. "Hey, team." The email read, complete with cartoon emojis. Do not forget to RSVP for Timmy's Marvel Bash this Saturday. There was no mention of quarterly bonuses, no mention of compliance achievements. By noon, Chad called an emergency culture pulse meeting in the central break room. He stood by the industrial coffee machine, with his arms spread wide, looking like an overly enthusiastic youth leader in designer sneakers. All right, beautiful people, Chad grinned, taking a sip from his branded water bottle. Let us get raw. Rachel let out a soft, bitter snort. Donald kept his eyes fixed on his laptop screen, refusing to look up. Come on, Chad coaxed, scanning the quiet room. Is it not refreshing? And family shows up for each other. You mean like showing up for the record-breaking fourth quarter we just successfully closed? I asked, my tone crisp and devoid of emotion. Chad blinked, his smile wavering for a split second. Well, sure, Valerie. My son Timmy is so excited to meet all of you this weekend. Nobody answered. The silence in the break room stretched until it became unbearable. Later that afternoon, Donald received an unprompted calendar invite titled Mindset Alignment Sync. The guest list consisted of Chad, Chloe from HR, and Donald's direct supervisor. There was no agenda attached, just a 30-minute block reserved for Chad to talk in vague circles about overcoming scarcity mindsets and unleashing corporate potential. When Donald finally emerged from the executive suite, 45 minutes later, he looked pale and exhausted. Did he mention the approved budget allocation? I asked quietly, walking over to his desk. Donald looked around the open plan office before leaning in to whisper. He told me that if our accounting team needs extra motivation to finalize the year-end books, we should picture the look on little Timmy's face when we walk into the party in full Marvel costumes. I clenched my jaw so hard I felt my molars ache. The following morning, an administrative assistant in finance accidentally forwarded an old budget approval document to our department group chat. It was a signed, time-stamped PDF from the chief financial officer, showing the $500,000 bonus pool fully authorized for release on the 15th of the month. Exciting transition, I thought as I stared at the bright monitor. What he actually meant was that he had seized the allocated bonus funds to finance personal executive initiatives and vanity projects. Then came the rolling cupcake cart. At 2 o'clock on Thursday, Chad personally approved a cart of bright pink cupcakes decorated with blue sprinkles and small edible QR code toppers. When our compliance team gathered for our regular end-of-week review, the atmosphere was deadly serious. Donald had not even bothered to open his laptop. I sat down at the head of the small conference table, opened my physical notebook, and spoke plainly. This is not just tone-deaf management. What do you mean, Valerie? Dylan asked nervously. I mean, it goes far beyond canceled bonuses and ridiculous costume parties, I explained, leaning forward. Chad is actively dismantling our internal control systems. That is legally dangerous. That night, I stayed at my desk until 7 o'clock. Not because I had pending daily tasks, but because my professional instincts were screaming at me to take action. I was not entirely sure what specific violation I would catch first, but I was determined to document every single anomaly before Chad could delete the evidence. At 10 o'clock that evening, a Slack notification pinged on my screen. It was a direct message from Chad, a waving hand emoji followed by a message. Hey Valerie, hope you are as pumped for Saturday as Timmy is. Attached was an image file. It was a child's crayon drawing of a green stick figure labeled Miss Valerie wearing a superhero cape, standing next to a smaller figure with a crown. I stared at the image for a long time. Then I opened a new directory on my secure drive, named it Regulatory Contingency Documentation, and began dragging the system logs inside, one by one. 2 weeks after the cupcake incident, the degradation of our compliance framework accelerated dramatically. I walked into our Monday morning briefing to find a complete stranger sitting in the leather chair, usually occupied by Eleanor Vance. Our senior legal counsel, the man sitting in her seat, was in his mid-30s, wearing an unstructured sky blue blazer, gelled hair, and a necklace made of polished wooden beads. He was casually eating yogurt from the communal refrigerator. Oh, hey there, he grinned, waving his spoon. I am Justin Pratt. He said you guys needed a fresh, agile perspective on compliance vibes. I froze in the doorway. Eleanor handled all formal regulatory reviews for our medical packaging documentation under federal standards. Justin leaned back in the chair, stretching his legs out. Nobody takes over anything in a modern ecosystem, Valerie. It is all about agility now, not getting bogged down in ancient bureaucratic red tape. Ancient red tape? I repeated, my voice dropping an octave. We package sterile medical components under strict federal oversight. Justin waved his hand dismissively. Yeah, well, I read this fascinating article on social media last week. Later that evening, I reread my notes from that conversation 3 times. I was utterly stunned by the combination of staggering ignorance and unearned confidence. By Thursday afternoon, the situation deteriorated from absurd to dangerous. While conducting a routine check of our procurement ledger, I discovered that a primary vendor supplying sterile polymer films had failed to submit their mandatory annual cleanroom recertification. Instead, the hold had been manually cleared in the system. The override credentials belonged to Justin Pratt. I marched straight into the office Justin was using, holding the printed audit log in my hand. Justin, why did you override the automated hold on the primary polymer vendor? Justin did not even look up from his phone. Oh yeah, we cleared it manually so production would not hit a speed bump. You cannot manually clear a federal compliance requirement, I said, placing the document on his desk. If this inventory is integrated into sterile medical packaging without valid certification, every single unit we ship is legally compromised. Justin leaned back, folding his arms with a patronizing smirk. Valerie, I think you are being incredibly rigid and defensive. They are compliant in spirit. In spirit? I stared at him. Federal auditors do not accept compliance in spirit. That night, I stayed in the building until the janitorial staff turned off the main hallway lights. I copied every single vendor certification file, raw procurement log, and manual override record to an off-network encrypted flash drive. The response arrived at 4 o'clock the following afternoon via a brief Slack message from Chad's assistant, Kiki. Hey Valerie. Just a quick heads up from Chad. Thanks for understanding. That same evening, Rachel Miller walked into the break room, dropped her security badge onto the counter, and began packing her personal belongings into a cardboard box. She had spent 6 years building our procurement verification protocol. I cannot do this anymore, Valerie, Rachel said, her voice shaking with quiet anger as she wiped her eyes. I spent my entire career maintaining sterile safety standards. Do not resign without documenting your reasons, I urged her quietly. I already sent a detailed statement to Human Resources, she replied bitterly. Chloe told me I was suffering from change fatigue and offered me a gift card for a local spa. Rachel walked out of the building at 6 o'clock and never returned. 3 days later, her formal resignation was processed, without a single word of inquiry from executive leadership. By the middle of the following week, the compliance department was collapsing under the weight of Chad's deliberate negligence. Donald was quietly archiving his accounting files, preparing for the inevitable fallout. Meanwhile, Justin continued to sign off on unverified vendor approvals like a child playing with a rubber stamp. He approved 3 separate supplier contracts that lacked mandatory legal disclosures, explicitly violating basic corporate governance principles and breaching the board's fiduciary duty to shareholders to preserve corporate assets and maintain lawful operations. I attempted one final direct intervention. I scheduled a 5-minute meeting with Chad, walked into his corner office, and shut the heavy glass door firmly behind me. Chad, we are facing an imminent regulatory catastrophe, I stated clearly, placing a summary ledger on his mahogany desk. We currently have 33 uncertified vendor files active in our production pipeline. Under federal law, executive officers can be held personally liable for gross corporate malfeasance. Chad did not even look at the paper. He was busy customizing a digital avatar on his computer screen for an upcoming presentation. Valerie, 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 he said, shaking his head with condescending pity. I know you are comfortable with the old rigid way of doing things. Chad, I said, my voice cold as ice. You are not trusting a process. Chad's expression instantly hardened, the fake golden retriever charm vanishing to reveal a cold, arrogant corporate narcissist. Let me make one thing crystal clear to you, Valerie. Do not ever question my managerial decisions again. I stared at him for 3 seconds. I did not raise my voice. I pulled out my personal leather notebook and wrote 4 words across the blank white page. He believes he is immune. Then I opened a master spreadsheet on my encrypted drive. I divided it into 3 distinct tabs. Tab 1, unauthorized compliance overrides and regulatory violations. Tab 2, vendor certification discrepancies and traceability failures. Tab 3, executive directives suppressing internal audit warnings. I worked continuously until midnight, cataloging every single email, timestamp, user identification code, and system log. By the time I closed my laptop, I had constructed an airtight chronological ledger of deliberate corporate malfeasance. The crisis reached its boiling point on Tuesday afternoon during an unannounced meeting that Chad called in our central conference room. He strolled into the room carrying a tray of lukewarm takeout food, followed by Justin, who was wearing his signature wooden beads. "All right, team," Chad announced, slamming his hands onto the table. "Let us get raw, real, and completely transparent. It is just that raw data is so rigid, so last decade, so utterly uninspiring." Donald adjusted his glasses, staring flatly across the table. "Uninspiring data?" "Exactly, Donald." Chad beamed, pointing at him aggressively. "You get it." I sat completely still, my pen hovering over my notepad. "Storytelling opportunities?" "Just hear me out," Chad said, leaning across the table with an artificial grin. "What if we just smooth out a few curves? We just need the narrative to pop." "You are asking the compliance and accounting team to falsify fourth-quarter regulatory filings," Donald said. His voice was remarkably quiet, but it cut through the room like a razor blade. "Whoa, whoa! Big scary words, Donald." Chad laughed nervously, waving his hands in defense. "I mean, what is a missing signature or an altered approval date between corporate family members?" Dylan looked like he was about to vomit. Justin sat back in his chair, nodding along as if Chad were delivering a masterclass in modern management. Donald did not yell. He did not slam his fists on the table. He did not return to his desk. Chad blinked, thoroughly taken aback. "Okay. You just requested federal compliance officers and certified accountants to commit felony corporate fraud under federal law," I said, my voice deadly calm. "Under Section 1514A of Title 18 of the United States Code and federal wire fraud statutes, soliciting the falsification of regulatory records carries severe criminal penalties." Chad's face flushed deep red, his friendly demeanor completely shattering. "Listen to me, Valerie. My son Timmy spent 3 hours making personalized thank you cards for all of you." "This meeting is over," I said, standing up and gathering my notebook. "Fine," Chad shouted after me, his voice cracking with rage. "Be ungrateful dinosaurs." 10 minutes later, as I sat at my desk with my heart pounding against my ribs, an email notification popped up on my monitor. It was a forwarded message, sent directly from Donald Briggs. The email was addressed to the full board of directors, the chairman of the board, chief legal counsel, and corporate internal audit subject. "Urgent notification regarding fourth quarter compliance filings." Body text: "We can no longer sign off on the Q4 compliance reports." That was it. One single devastating sentence. I stared at the screen, letting out a long, slow breath. Beside me, Dylan read the email over my shoulder and whispered, "Holy Mother of God." The silence that blanketed the office over the next 48 hours was thick, suffocating, and absolute. Nobody discussed the email in the break rooms. By Wednesday morning, executive retaliatory measures began in full force. My administrative system access was silently restricted. The entire corporate legal department went completely dark, their email automated responses switching to a uniform message: "For all urgent corporate inquiries, please contact the office of the chairman of the board." Meanwhile, Chad seemed entirely oblivious to the incoming storm. He spent Wednesday afternoon in the main atrium, wearing an oversized Black Panther hoodie, screaming into his phone about inflatable obstacle course logistics. A massive inflatable obstacle course blocked the main entrance to the executive suite. At 3 o'clock on Thursday afternoon, Chad swaggered into our silent compliance suite, holding a frosted cupcake on a paper superhero plate. He leaned against my desk with sickening confidence. "Hey there, Wonder Woman," he grinned, taking a bite of frosting. "A little nervous about Donald's dramatic little email stunt." I looked up from my screen, refusing to respond. "Let us be real for a second, Valerie. Chad continued, chewing loudly. It is all just corporate theater. That scapegoat is definitely not going to be me. I stared at him, marveling at his absolute delusion. I am taking the remainder of the afternoon off to compile my personal records, I said flatly. Chad waved his frosting-covered hand dismissively. Sure, whatever. Timmy will be heartbroken if his favorite compliance officer misses his big day. I packed my laptop into my leather shoulder bag, stood up, and walked out of the suite without uttering another word. I did not go home. Instead, I walked straight down to the basement storage archive. A forgotten, windowless room filled with dusty metal shelving, decommissioned office furniture, and discarded paper shredders. I pulled out my encrypted thumb drive and began assembling the master dossier. For 18 continuous hours, I did not leave that basement room except to use the restroom and drink black coffee from a vending machine. My spine felt like solid steel. My fingers moved across the keyboard with mechanical precision. Tab 1 detailed 33 specific vendor file discrepancies, including 17 uncertified medical packaging suppliers introduced into production. Tab 2 cataloged 19 manual compliance overrides executed by Justin Pratt without technical authorization, complete with system IP addresses, timestamps, and server metadata. I attached 86 primary Mary supporting PDF documents, cross-referencing every single claim against specific sections of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, Federal Manufacturing Standards under Title 21 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 11, and corporate fiduciary duty mandates under state law. I added an appendix titled Timeline of Managerial Coercion, detailing the systematic suppression of internal audit warnings. By 6 o'clock on Friday morning, as the sun began to rise over the parking lot, the document was complete. It contained 98 pages of pristine, unassailable evidence. I sat back in the metal folding chair, flexed my aching fingers, and saved the final build onto 3 separate encrypted flash drives. I labeled one drive with a simple black marker, Q4 Master Audit Trail. The rage that had been burning inside me for 3 weeks had completely cooled into something pristine, sharp, and lethal. I was no longer defending myself. By 8 o'clock on Saturday morning, the corporate headquarters of Neopharm Systems looked less like a medical manufacturing facility and more like a chaotic theme park that had been taken over by a delusional executive. Bright red, blue, and yellow balloons floated near the ceiling of the 3-story atrium. The sickening smell of cheap sugar frosting and rubber balloons hung heavy in the air. A few dozen employees shuffled around the lobby in forced costumes. Looking utterly miserable, Chad stood on a temporary wooden stage in the center of the atrium, wearing an absurdly tight Captain America t-shirt and holding a foam shield. He was shouting into a microphone over a portable sound system, playing superhero movie theme songs. "That is what I am talking about, team," Chad roared, banging his foam shield against his hip. "This is what real corporate culture looks like. He builds synergy." I walked into the lobby wearing my standard gray business suit, ignoring the costume mandate entirely. I carried my leather briefcase firmly in my right hand. The chairman's motorcade just pulled into the executive parking garage. He brought 4 senior corporate attorneys and 2 forensic audit partners. I took a deep, steady breath, walked past the balloons, past the blaring music, and headed directly up the grand staircase toward the executive conference suite. As I reached the top floor, the heavy glass doors of the executive boardroom swung open. Chairman Henderson, a tall, iron gray-haired man in an immaculate charcoal suit, stepped into the hallway. He stopped when he saw me standing in the hallway. "Valerie Cross," he asked, his voice low and commanding. "Yes, Mr. Chairman," I replied calmly. "Donald Briggs informed me that you hold the complete technical audit trail for the 4th quarter," he stated, looking directly into my eyes. Without saying a word, I opened my briefcase, pulled out the bound 98-page master dossier and the encrypted USB flash drive, and placed them directly into his hands. "Everything you need to know about the regulatory integrity of this facility begins on page 1, I said cleanly. Chairman Henderson took the dossier, opened the cover page, and began reading right there in the hallway. For 10 agonizing minutes, nobody spoke. As he reached page 32, Chairman Henderson's jaw flexed tightly. He closed the binder with a heavy, sharp thud that echoed down the quiet corridor. This is not merely managerial incompetence, Chairman Henderson said, his voice cold enough to freeze water. This is gross negligence, breach of fiduciary duty, and intentional regulatory exposure. He turned to his chief legal counsel. Executed the emergency board resolution immediately. Then, Chairman Henderson turned and walked down the grand staircase toward the atrium, his heavy leather shoes striking the steps like the slow, deliberate beats of an executioner's drum. The four attorneys and I followed directly behind him. Down in the atrium, Chad was still standing on stage, waving his foam shield and shouting into the microphone, "Remember, guys, Chad Montgomery." Chairman Henderson's voice cut through the blaring party music like a steel blade. It was not loud, but it possessed an authority that instantly silenced the entire room. The portable speaker fell silent as an intern frantically pulled the plug. The employees frozen in the lobby turned around in unison. Chad blinked, squinched his eyes against the stage lights, and let out a forced, nervous laugh. "Oh, we have gluten-free. You are relieved of your duties as Chief Executive Officer of Neopharm Systems, effective immediately," Chairman Henderson stated. His voice ringing clearly across the quiet atrium. Chad's forced smile froze on his face. The foam shield slipped slightly in his hand. "We are building culture. Your employment contract is terminated for cause due to gross misconduct, breach of fiduciary duty, and willful violation of corporate governance laws." Chairman Henderson continued, completely unbothered by Chad's panic. "You are stripped of all executive authority, stock options, and severance entitlements." Two uniformed corporate security officers stepped out from the shadows near the security gate, moving swiftly to flank Chad on the stage. "Wait, hold on a minute," Chad stammered, his face turning ghost white as the reality of his total ruin crashed down upon him. "Cap would never give up like this. Escort Mr. Montgomery from the premises immediately," Chairman Henderson ordered calmly. The entire room watched in absolute stunned silence as the security guards firmly grabbed Chad by his arms and led him down the stage stairs. His Captain America t-shirt was wrinkled and stained with cupcake frosting. His foam shield fell to the floor and rolled uselessly across the linoleum. Justin Pratt tried to quietly slide out through the side exit, but two corporate legal aides blocked his path, handing him a formal legal notice preserving all electronic records for upcoming regulatory investigations. Chairman Henderson walked onto the center stage, picked up the microphone, and looked across the assembled crowd. "Effective immediately, all pending fourth-quarter reporting is suspended under formal internal audit review," Chairman Henderson announced clearly. "Furthermore, the Board of Directors has unanimously voted to fully reinstate and immediately disburse the $500,000 team bonus pool to all eligible compliance, accounting, and operational personnel." A collective gasp went up through the lobby, followed by a sudden wave of applause from employees who had been pushed to the absolute brink of despair. Chairman Henderson stepped off the stage, walked directly over to where I was standing near the stairwell, and extended his hand. "Valerie," he said, looking at me with deep professional respect, "your extraordinary diligence, moral courage, and flawless documentation saved this organization from total regulatory collapse." I shook his hand firmly. "I accept, Mr. Namit," he replied. "Donald Briggs is immediately promoted to Chief Accounting Officer, and we are given complete independence to restore our compliance standards without managerial interference." "Done," Chairman Henderson said without a single second of hesitation. By 5 o'clock that evening, the balloons had been cleared from the lobby. The Thor obstacle course was being deflated and loaded into the back of a rental truck. I sat in my new executive office on the top floor, looking out over the quiet Ohio skyline as the evening sun dipped below the horizon. On my desk sat a brand new nameplate and my updated security badge, granting full administrative access to all global systems. My phone chimed with a notification from my bank. I opened the application to see a direct deposit confirmation. $1,200, fully cleared and archived. "Hey, buddy," I said, a genuine smile spreading across my face for the first time in months. "Pack your bags." I hung up the phone, closed my laptop, and leaned back in my chair. There were no superhero costumes. There was only the quiet, earned weight of integrity restored, authority reclaimed, and justice served.